For 8 years, I was invisible. Not the kind of invisible that comes from being shy or overlooked. The kind that comes from being so perfectly, predictably there that people forget you're human. My name is Marina Chen, and I was the senior secretary at Sterling & Associates, one of Manhattan's most prestigious law firms. Every morning at 7:45 a.m., I would unlock the mahogany doors, brew the first pot of Colombian coffee, and arrange the morning newspapers on Alexander Sterling's desk in perfect order. Wall Street Journal on the left, Financial Times in the center, New York Times on the right. Alexander Sterling was the kind of man who commanded rooms without trying. 6'2". Silver hair that looked expensive even when disheveled, and eyes the color of winter slate. He wore power like other men wore cologne, liberally and with absolute confidence that everyone would notice. To him, I was furniture. Useful furniture, but furniture nonetheless. Marina, coffee, he would say without looking up from his papers. Marina, get Johnson on the line. Marina, cancel my 3 o'clock. Never please. Never thank you. Never eye contact. In 8 years, I don't think Alexander Sterling had ever looked at me long enough to register that I was a person with thoughts, feelings, or God forbid, opinions. The other attorneys weren't much better. They would discuss their most sensitive cases right in front of me, as if I were a potted plant. Hostile takeovers, celebrity divorces, corporate cover-ups. I absorbed it all while quietly typing, filing, answering phones. To them, I was background noise, part of the office ecosystem. As permanent and unremarkable as the marble floors, or the crystal chandelier in the lobby. What they didn't know was that I held a Juris Doctor from Columbia Law School. I had graduated summa cum laude, passed the New York bar exam on my first try, and had originally applied to Sterling & Associates as a junior associate. The rejection letter was polite but firm. While your academic credentials are impressive, we feel you lack the aggressive personality necessary for litigation work. So I applied for the secretary position. It was supposed to be temporary, just until I found something else. That was 8 years ago. I told myself I was learning, observing, waiting for the right opportunity. The truth was, I had become comfortable in my invisibility. There was safety in being underestimated, in being dismissed. No one expected anything from Marina the secretary except perfect coffee and flawless typing. But comfort, I was about to learn, is a luxury that can disappear overnight. It was a Tuesday morning in October when everything changed. The leaves outside our 15th floor windows were turning gold, and there was that crisp quality to the air that made Manhattan feel electric with possibility. I was at my desk by 7:30, as always, preparing for another day of beautiful, predictable invisibility. Alexander arrived at exactly 8:15, his usual time. He strode past my desk without acknowledgement, his Hermes briefcase swinging at his side. I gave him precisely 3 minutes to settle in before bringing his coffee, Colombian black, no sugar, served in the Wedgwood china cup his wife had given him for their 20th anniversary. Marina, he said without looking up, clear my schedule for this afternoon. I have a meeting with the Meridian Group. The Meridian Group, I knew that name. They were a real estate development company that had been in the news recently for some questionable land acquisitions. Alexander had been working on something related to them for months, but the details had been kept unusually confidential. At 20:30 p.m., 3 men in expensive suits arrived. I recognized Marcus Webb, Meridian's CEO, from his photo in Forbes. The other 2 were unfamiliar, but they carried themselves with the particular arrogance of men who were accustomed to getting their way. Marina, hold all calls. Alexander instructed, closing his office door behind them. I went back to my typing, but something felt different. The atmosphere was charged, electric. Through Alexander's office windows, I could see animated gestures, papers being spread across his conference table, serious faces bent over documents. At 30:45, Alexander opened his door. Marina, we need fresh coffee. The good stuff from my private reserve. And those Danish pastries from the place on 5th Avenue. As I prepared the coffee service, I could hear fragments of conversation drifting from the office. Words like zoning permits, city council, and expedited approval floated past me. I arranged the pastries on Alexander's crystal serving tray and knocked softly on his door. Come, Alexander called. I entered the office, my eyes downcast in my usual subservient manner. The 3 men were hunched over a spread of architectural plans and legal documents. I began setting up the coffee service on the side table, moving with the quiet efficiency they expected from their invisible secretary. The beauty of this arrangement, Marcus Webb was saying, is that nobody questions a law firm representing multiple clients. Sterling and Associates files the permits for the shell companies buy the properties, and 6 months later, Meridian acquires all the properties in one clean transaction. Alexander poured himself coffee, completely oblivious to my presence 3 feet away. The timing is crucial, he said. The city council vote on the rezoning happens Thursday. Once that passes, these properties will be worth 50 times what we're paying for them now. The third man, whose name I hadn't caught, leaned forward. And you're certain the council members we've influenced will vote the right way? Alexander's laugh was cold. Councilman Rodriguez owes us for getting his son out of that DUI mess. Councilwoman Park's husband's construction company has 3 contracts pending our approval. They'll vote correctly. I continued arranging the pastries, my hands steady despite the thundering of my heart. They were discussing bribery, corruption, possibly conspiracy. And they were doing it in front of me as if I were a lamp or a coffee table. What about the current property owners? Marcus asked. Some of them have been fighting the buyout offers. Leave that to me. Alexander said, and his tone made me shiver. I have ways of making people more reasonable. Amazing how a few strategic lawsuits can change someone's perspective on selling. The second man chuckled. You really are ruthless, Sterling. I respect that. I finished my tasks and glided silently from the room, closing the door behind me. My hands were shaking as I sat down at my desk. In the space of 10 minutes, I had heard enough to bring down not just Alexander Sterling, but potentially several city officials, and one of New York's largest development companies. For the first time in 8 years, I felt truly awake. Over the next few weeks, I became a different kind of invisible. Instead of simply existing in the background, I actively cultivated it. I invested in a small digital recorder, no bigger than a credit card, which I kept in my blazer pocket. I learned to position myself strategically during meetings, always with a legitimate reason to be nearby, refreshing water glasses, delivering documents, adjusting the thermostat. The Meridian conspiracy was just the beginning. Alexander Sterling, I discovered, was not simply a high-powered attorney. He was the center of a web of corruption that stretched from Manhattan real estate to Brooklyn construction contracts to Queens zoning boards. He had been operating this way for years, using his law firm as a front for money laundering, bribery, and intimidation. I documented everything. Names, dates, bank account numbers carelessly mentioned in conversations. I photographed documents with my phone when Alexander left his office for lunch. I made copies of files when I was asked to organize his filing cabinets. The irony was delicious. Alexander trusted me completely because he had never bothered to see me as a threat. To him, I was nothing more than a very efficient piece of office equipment. It never occurred to him that office equipment might be listening, recording, remembering. The breakthrough came in November. Alexander was meeting with a new client, a nervous-looking man named Tony Castellano, who owned a small construction company in Brooklyn. I brought in coffee and immediately recognized the signs of a man being systematically destroyed. Mr. Castellano, Alexander was saying as I arranged the coffee cups. I understand you're having some difficulties with the city inspectors. Tony's hands shook as he reached for his coffee. They're shutting down all my jobs, Mr. Sterling. 23 violations in 2 weeks. I've been in business 15 years, never had problems like this. Alexander's smile was predatory. City inspectors can be overzealous. Fortunately, I have relationships that can help resolve these issues, for a reasonable fee, of course. How much? Tony asked desperately. 50,000. Half up front, half when your projects are back online. I nearly dropped the sugar bowl. Tony Castellano was being extorted. His construction projects had probably been targeted specifically to force him into Alexander's web. It was a protection racket dressed in legal language. I don't have that kind of money, Tony stammered. Alexander leaned back in his leather chair. Well, Tony, may I call you Tony? You might want to consider selling your business. I happen to know some developers who are always looking for established construction companies. They pay fair prices. I knew exactly which developers he meant. The same ones who were systematically buying up properties across Brooklyn and Queens through Alexander's shell company scheme. That night, I sat in my small apartment in Queens, staring at my laptop screen. I had enough evidence to destroy Alexander Sterling and his entire network. Bank records, recorded conversations, documented meetings. The question was, what should I do with it? For 8 years I had been the perfect employee. Punctual, efficient, invisible. I had absorbed insults, dismissals, and condescension with quiet dignity. I had watched Alexander Sterling destroy people's lives and businesses, while treating me like I was barely human. But I wasn't just Marina the secretary anymore. I was Marina Chen, Juris Doctor, Columbia Law School, and I had a decision to make. I picked up my phone and dialed a number I had memorized weeks ago. FBI Public Corruption Unit. Agent Sarah Rodriguez speaking. My voice was steady, confident. Professional, Agent Rodriguez. My name is Marina Chen. I have information about a conspiracy involving city officials, real estate developers, and systematic corruption. I think you're going to want to hear this. The meeting was set for the following Friday at a small cafe in Midtown. Agent Rodriguez was younger than I had expected, with sharp eyes and an intensity that reminded me of a hawk. She listened to my preliminary information with growing interest, occasionally asking clarifying questions that told me she knew exactly what she was hearing. Ms. Chen, she said finally. What you're describing would require a significant undercover operation. We would need you to continue in your position, gathering evidence, possibly for several more months. Are you prepared for that? I thought about 8 years of invisibility. 8 years of watching Alexander Sterling treat people as disposable. 8 years of being dismissed, ignored, and underestimated. Agent Rodriguez, I said, I've been preparing for this my entire career. The next phase was the most dangerous. I continued my daily routine, coffee at 17:45, newspapers arranged perfectly, phone calls answered with cheerful efficiency. But now I was working with federal agents, carefully documenting every illegal conversation, every corrupt transaction. Alexander never suspected. Why would he? I was just Marina, reliable and unremarkable. The FBI provided me with sophisticated recording equipment that looked like ordinary office supplies. A pen that recorded audio, a desk clock with a hidden camera, a phone charger that transmitted data. The evidence mounted. Alexander's corruption went deeper than I had initially realized. He wasn't just facilitating real estate fraud, he was operating what amounted to a criminal enterprise. City inspectors, zoning officials, and construction contractors were all part of a network that Alexander controlled through a combination of bribes, blackmail, and intimidation. Tony Castellano became my test case. Instead of paying Alexander's extortion fee, he agreed to wear a wire provided by the FBI. The recording of Alexander explicitly demanding $50,000 to make inspector problems go away was crystal clear. But Alexander was careful. He never put anything explicitly criminal in writing. He used coded language in emails, met sensitive contacts away from the office, and generally behaved like a man who understood he was walking a legal tightrope. That's where my 8 years of invisibility became invaluable. Alexander felt comfortable saying anything in front of me. I recorded conversations about bribing councilmen, intimidating property owners, and laundering money through fake legal fees. To him, I might as well have been a filing cabinet. The operation climaxed on a cold December morning. Alexander had called an emergency meeting with the core members of his corruption network. The rezoning vote that would make them all wealthy was scheduled for the following week. But apparently, some of the purchased council members were getting nervous. I arrived early as always and set up the conference room. The FBI's hidden cameras were in place, disguised as routine office equipment. My personal recorder was fully charged, tucked safely in my blazer pocket. At 9 a.m., they began arriving. Marcus Webb from Meridian. 2 city councilmen I recognized from photographs. A construction contractor named Vinnie Torino, who looked like he belonged in a Martin Scorsese film. And 3 other men whose roles in the conspiracy I had documented over the past months. I served coffee and pastries, invisible as always. They waited until I left the room before beginning their discussion, but that was fine. The FBI's cameras would capture everything. What I didn't expect was Alexander calling me back into the room 20 minutes later. Marina, he said, not looking up from a spreadsheet of numbers. We're going to need you to take notes. Detailed notes. And Marina, finally, he looked at me, but his eyes were cold, almost threatening. Everything discussed in this room today is absolutely confidential. Attorney-client privilege, you understand. I nodded, my expression appropriately subservient. Of course, Mr. Sterling. I took a seat at the small side table, where I usually sat during meetings, pulled out a legal pad, and began writing. But I wasn't just taking notes. I was documenting the final meeting of Alexander Sterling's criminal enterprise. For the next 90 minutes, I listened to 8 men discuss the systematic corruption of New York City's zoning process. They talked about specific council members they had purchased, the exact amounts of bribes they had paid, and their plans for intimidating anyone who interfered with their scheme. Marcus Webb spread out maps showing the properties they intended to acquire. Once the rezoning passes, we'll have 6 months to complete the acquisitions before property values spike. Sterling's shell companies will handle the initial purchases, then transfer ownership to Meridian subsidiaries. A councilman Rodriguez was nervous, repeatedly wiping sweat from his forehead. What if someone connects the dots? What if the press starts investigating? Alexander's smile was confident. Let them investigate. Everything is perfectly legal on paper. Shell companies buying properties, legitimate law firm providing services, city council voting on a routine rezoning measure. The beauty is that even if someone suspects something, they can't prove anything. The irony was exquisite. Alexander Sterling, criminal mastermind, was explaining his entire scheme while I recorded every word, sitting 3 feet away, invisible as always. Vinnie Torino spoke up. What about the property owners who won't sell? Alexander's expression darkened. We've discussed this. Strategic pressure, code violations, permit delays, construction accidents. People become more reasonable when their alternatives disappear. I kept writing, my face a mask of professional concentration. Inside, I was burning with 8 years of suppressed fury. These men were casually discussing destroying people's lives, treating human beings as obstacles to be removed. The meeting ended at 10:30. I collected coffee cups and pastry plates while the men filed out, each one ignoring me completely. Alexander returned to his office, and I went back to my desk. At 11:15 I stepped into the ladies' room and called Agent Rodriguez. It's done, I said simply. The FBI moved fast. By Thursday morning, one day before the crucial city council vote, federal agents were executing search warrants across Manhattan, Brooklyn, and Queens. Alexander Sterling was arrested at his office at 8:23 a.m., while I was at my desk typing what would turn out to be his final correspondence. I watched through the glass walls as agents led him away in handcuffs. For the first time in 8 years, Alexander Sterling looked directly at me. His face was a mask of confusion and rage, but underneath, I saw something else: the dawning realization that his invisible secretary had somehow orchestrated his downfall. The news broke within hours. Massive corruption scheme exposed. The headlines read, Federal agents arrest prominent attorney. City officials. Alexander Sterling's name was all over the front pages of the newspapers I used to arrange so carefully on his desk. The trials took almost a year. I testified as the prosecution's key witness, presenting 8 years' worth of evidence I had collected. Alexander's defense attorney tried to portray me as a disgruntled employee seeking revenge, but the recordings were damning. You could hear Alexander's own voice discussing bribes, intimidation, and money laundering. He was convicted on 17 federal charges and sentenced to 15 years in prison. Marcus Webb got 12 years. The 2 councilmen were removed from office and sentenced to 8 years each. The entire conspiracy collapsed like a house of cards. But the most satisfying moment came 3 months after Alexander's arrest, when the partners at Sterling and Associates called me into the main conference room. "Ms. Chen," said Patricia Morgenstern, the senior partner, "we've been reviewing your work during this difficult period, and frankly, we're amazed. You've kept this firm running smoothly despite everything that's happened." I sat quietly, hands folded, waiting. "We've also learned about your educational background," Patricia continued. "Columbia Law School, summa cum laude. Passed the bar 8 years ago. We had no idea. Of course they didn't, I had been invisible. Would like to offer you a position as a junior associate," Patricia said. "With full credit for your years of experience here. It's not common to promote from within like this. But given the circumstances." I looked around the conference room at the 4 partners. These were people who had ignored me, dismissed me, and treated me as furniture for 8 years. Now they were offering me the position I had originally applied for, the one they had rejected because I lacked aggressive personality. I smiled politely. "Thank you for the offer, Ms. Morgenstern, but I'm afraid I have to decline." Patricia looked surprised. "May I ask why?" I stood up, smoothing my skirt. Because yesterday, I accepted a partnership offer from Chen and Associates. The confusion on their faces was beautiful. Chen and Associates, my new firm, I explained. I'm taking 17 clients with me, all people who were being extorted, intimidated, or defrauded by Alexander Sterling's network. Turns out there's quite a market for legal representation for corruption victims. I moved toward the door, then paused, looking back at the 4 partners who were staring at me as if I were a stranger. Oh, and Ms. Morgenstern. Tony Castellano sends his regards. He's going to be my first client. Something about recovering the $50,000 he paid to this firm under duress. I walked out of Sterling and Associates for the last time, my heels clicking authoritatively on the marble floor. The security guard nodded respectfully as I passed. The same guard who had looked through me for 8 years. 6 months later, Chen and Associates occupied a full floor of a midtown office building. I had 12 associates working for me, including 3 other lawyers who had been systematically underestimated by their previous firms. We specialized in representing victims of corporate corruption, with a particular focus on real estate fraud and municipal corruption. My former invisibility had become my greatest strength. I understood how powerful men operated when they thought nobody was watching. I knew their patterns, their weaknesses, their blind spots. Most importantly, I knew that the people they dismissed, secretaries, clerks, assistants, often held the keys to their destruction. Alexander Sterling wrote me a letter from federal prison 6 months into his sentence. It was a single paragraph. Marina, I underestimated you. That was my mistake. But you should know that what you did was personal, not professional. You destroyed lives out of spite. I hope you can live with that. I never replied. But if I had, I would have told him that he was wrong about one thing. It wasn't personal, it was justice, and sometimes justice comes from the most invisible places. Today, I sit in my corner office, looking out over Manhattan's skyline. My desk is mahogany, like Alexander's used to be. My coffee is Colombian, served in bone china, but when my secretary brings it to me, I always look her in the eye. Thank you, Sarah, I say. How was your weekend? Because I learned something important during my 8 years of invisibility. Everyone deserves to be seen. Everyone deserves to be heard. And sometimes, the most powerful thing you can do is remember that the person serving your coffee is a human being with thoughts, dreams, and the potential to change everything. Alexander Sterling saw me as furniture. That was his fatal mistake. Because furniture doesn't fight back. Furniture doesn't record conversations. Furniture doesn't bring down entire criminal enterprises. But I do. My name is Marina Chen. I am not invisible anymore, and for 8 years, I was the silent secretary who listened to everything, remembered everything, and ultimately, revealed everything. The powerful have always underestimated the quiet ones. The ones who work in the background, the ones they don't bother to really see. They think we're harmless because we're helpful. They think we're weak because we're polite. They're wrong. We are the ones who keep their calendars, who know their schedules, who hear their phone calls and see their emails. We are the ones who witness their moments of truth, when they think nobody important is watching. And sometimes, we are the ones who decide that enough is enough. Did you like this story of silent strength and strategic justice? Tell us in the comments which city you're listening from. If you enjoyed Marina's incredible journey from invisible secretary to powerful attorney, please support us with a super thanks, so we can continue bringing you more incredible life stories like this one. Thank you so much for your support. We look forward to your comments about Marina's amazing transformation. On the screen, you can see 2 new life stories that we highly recommend. There's so much more content on our channel. Don't forget to subscribe. See you in the next life story, with love and respect.